Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Abby Ashkenazi. I know you think by now I would know to unmute myself before I speak on a Zoom conversation. Um, we so happy you're joining us this morning. We're going to have a conversation with Eran Rickless. But before we get started, just a few little bit of housekeeping. Um, Please remain on mute during the uh, conversation. We'll take your conversation in the form of chat in the chat box. Does everyone know how to use that? Okay, I'm seeing nods. Okay, and we're a lot of people on the call. Not everybody is showing us their videos, so um, I just wanted to let Iran know, besides the people here, we're about 22 or 25 people in the conversation. So, welcome to Chicago Loves Israel. And I'm so glad that Chicago loves Israel all the time and not just on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I hope you enjoyed watching the films that we selected. It was hard. It was a hard pick, because um, these are two really prolific filmmakers, and it was hard to choose which films to show as most representative of their work. You'll notice that Dina isn't with us this morning. And please joining me in wishing Eran Mazal Tov on the birth of a new granddaughter. The Safta was needed. Uh, Somewhere else this morning. So, but we feel like Iran has a good grip on Dina's work as well, and we'll enjoy a conversation with Iran. So, Iran, I think our first question
Yes.
is, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good evening from
Good
Tel Aviv.
evening,
Yeah.
7 o'clock now in Israel. So I guess our first question is if you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, born in Jerusalem way back in the 50s, and then raised actually in Montreal and New York because of my father's work. He was a nuclear scientist, so it was kind of all a bit mysterious. So I grew up actually in North America until the age of six something. Then we moved from. My mother always used to say I moved from the Upper West Side all the way down to Beersheba, which is the capital of the Negev, in the south. It was only sand in those days, so I think her tears were kind of, in the soil. But we moved to there because of the nuclear center, the very top secret nuclear center in the south of Israel, and that's where I grew up. But we had a lot of, ventures back to New Haven, then to Brazil, which was quite exciting for 3 years, and an American high school in Rio de Janeiro in the late 60s, Vietnam, Israel post 1967. So it was really growing up in very significant times for me. I'll probably talk about it later because I always talk about my literature teacher. Whatever conversation I have, I get to her. And then back in Israel, graduated, went to the army, was in the Yom Kippur War, unfortunately, but it's part of my story. And then literally a day after I finished my service, I went to Tel Aviv University, started making short films, started working in the industry. And then I sort of said, I need something more ambitious. And I tried to get into what was considered the best film school in the world in England. And I got in for some reason. I think I was the first and the last Israeli. So whatever that means. And from there on, I think my first film, which was actually my graduation film, was called On a Clear Day You Can See Damascus. And I think if you think about that title, you can understand where I was headed. And from there on, it was just making films and trying to be a good person. So that's basically it.
Okay. Um, so we have someone who's asking, where on
Where?
the west side did you grow up?
Yeah,
May-
I
may-
grew up on 110th Street, which is a kind of mythological street between Broadway and Amsterdam. And it's actually quite amazing because in my apartment, like a friend of mine from Brazil that I mentioned before, actually lives by some weird chance in the same apartment I lived in the 50s. He lives there now, so it's kind of, I don't know, it's like a Polanski movie, Rosemary's Baby or something. But yeah, no, I was a kid. I was really a kid. And I can't really remember if it, 110th Street now is kind of totally really Upper West Side, but in those days, I guess it was different. But on the other hand, my father worked at Columbia, so that was actually the reason we were up there.
Yeah. So your background is very different than Dina's background.
Yeah, Dina was born in Iraq,
Mm.
came here in the early 50s. Classic immigration story. The Iraqis are quite different than most of the Jewish communities that came from Arab countries back then and later on. And they consider themselves, maybe everybody does, but the Iraqis are kind of really, above everyone else. So, and they were all, very well off in Iraq, but they came with nothing because they were basically, chased out. So Dina's mother, who's still alive, is still with us, came from a family of 7 brothers and sisters who were all kind of, did all sorts of things. Her mother had a tough life. She worked in all her life at Elite, which Elite was used, now it's a different name, but it used to be the big chocolate company here. And I think she worked in the chewing gum division. So that was kind of, and Dina grew up with 2 older brothers. And, she grew up in the Ma'abara, basically, initially. Not very long, but, quite crucial, I think, in her upbringing. And then Ramat Gan, which is Ramat Gan. Today, it's a lot of Russians, but essentially it's an Iraqi neighborhood of Tel Aviv. I mean, it's an adjacent city, but it's really a lot of Iraqis lived there. And there was always a joke back in 91 when Saddam Hussein was, sending missiles to this area. He was aiming at Iraq just to get rid of all those Iraqi Jews, but he missed. So, and Dina, she really, I think, built herself from scratch, basically. And she actually studied theater at university, and she was aiming to be an actress. But I think once she graduated, she understood it's a tough life. So she went and she kind of diverged into working on film sets as a script supervisor and stuff like that. And then we met actually on a film set. I was first assistant director. She was script supervisor, and was supposed to be a summer romance, but here we are. So.
Okay. So what about your literature teacher?
Ah, well,
Yeah.
it's a long story, but I'll make it short. I had this amazing teacher called Mrs. Walter, Beverly Walter. And the thing was, I was a kid who came, I was barely 14. This is post 1967, when really I think all Israelis thought that we are the new Roman Empire. And I came to Brazil, which was a dictatorship on one hand. On the other hand, the American school, American high school was like the essence of America in a way. They're totally democratic, but also totally divided between those who supported the war in Vietnam and those who were against it. So it was almost like, between the crew cuts and the long hair and all that. And for me, it was like a new world, and Beverly, or Mrs. Walter, came into the class and she said, okay, kids, like all kids around the world, we're going to study Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, because everybody does. But before that, we're going to study a book that only came out a few years ago. This is 1968. And she presented us with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which, I read that when I was like 14 something, and it literally blew my mind. It was like, I just couldn't, it was not translated into Hebrew in those days. So really for me, it was something completely new. And I think even when I look back today, it's a book. And then came some other films, Jack Nicholson, Five Easy Pieces, all sorts of things that I was exposed to. But I think the politics of Vietnam, plus the politics of Brazil, plus coming from Israel, plus Randall McMurphy from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest really kind of forged my personality, at least in those days. And the end of the story, basically, I mean, she was really this amazing teacher, had a strong impact. But then when I left and went back to Israel, I never got in touch with her somehow, sadly. And then I think 20 years ago, I suddenly realized that I should look her up. And sadly, I discovered that she passed away a few months before I discovered, I went to the school's website, because even 20 years ago, there was already a website and all that. And I left a note and got in touch with some old friends. And literally 3 years now, I had to add one thing is that she was a Vietnam widow, which added to her, persona. And 3 years ago, somehow through some connections, I got to track down her son, John, who was like, in the American yearbooks that you all know very well. It's the man most likely to succeed kind of guy. And I discovered him, and turned out he's an engineer, and he lives in Mozambique, in Africa. And I wrote him an email, and he was like shocked. And then we had a long Skype. This was before Zoom. Uh, about everything and about his mother. And I was saying, I'm thinking about maybe making a film. And basically, he was crying for 3 hours because he was so moved by the fact that, here's the student. And then I say to him, and John, the fact that your mother was a Vietnam widow and all that. And he says, say again. I say, a Vietnam widow. And he says, no, my father is actually still alive. They were divorced. And I suddenly realized that all my life I grew up on this notion of, this woman being a widow with somebody where her husband killed in Vietnam, but actually it was not true. And I said to myself, and I said to John, this is cinema. You take something which at its core is kind of emotional and strong, but you twist the facts a bit. And for me, it was really a very moving and interesting example. Plus, I had a lot of stories around her because 5 years ago, I was a visiting professor at Emory in Atlanta. And I was doing a Q&A after, I think, The Syrian Bride. And I was talking about Mrs. Walter because, as I said, I talk about her. And somebody in the audience came up to me later and he said, yeah, I was actually her lover in Brazil. So, it's a crazy world, as we all know. So that's Mrs. Walter in a nutshell.
Okay. We must be this around the same vintage because I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when I was 14, and I remember the name of the teacher who brought it to the class. So it must have been.
Yeah,
I'm sure everybody else had that, pretty much remembers that
for sure,
experience
for
too.
sure.
So,
I have to say, I'm still upset. I mean, it's silly, but I'm still upset by the fact that I never managed to make a film out of the book because, somebody else made it. And,
right,
yeah.
right. So let's talk about some of the films that you did make. um, and when we so I watched Lemon Tree and preparing for this conversation, and I don't know if it was the third time or the fourth time. I'm a big consumer of Israeli screen. Like, you know, I watch everything Israel. And so this time when I saw it, I was trying to imagine like exactly where it was, if it had a real place, because of
Mm,
the the road sign in the opening of the film says Eyal, and I lived in Kochav Yair, which was next to Kibbutz
yeah.
Eyal. So I
Yeah.
was just and we had a lot of politicians there. But anyways, so I want to hear about like if it was a real place and um, just you know some if your feelings about that film and today if you would have made the same told the same story.
Yeah, Lemon Tree came after The Syrian Bride, which was a rather big success, and I felt two things: A, where do I go from there? B, I really wanted to work with Yam Abbas, who had a like a leading role in Syrian Bride, but I felt I could do something maybe bigger and deeper with her. And I was literally, I think it was a Saturday morning, I was Googling something. I have no idea what, but I came across this like two lines, and it is Kochav Yair, by the way. And actually, the chief of staff, Shaul Mofaz, lived there.
That's right. He's
And
my neighbor.
yeah, it's a true story. It's basically, I read something about this Palestinian woman going all the way up to the high courts and losing, but obviously, then when I and that was basically it was like a
Right.
woman sued the Minister of Defense, and that was that. But then I dug up the court's decision. It was something like 40 pages by three women judges, and I said, okay, I have a film. And in reality, it was olive trees, and I said, okay, olive trees are a bit of a cliche, so I said lemon trees could be interesting. And I thought about Trini Lopez, and it's kind of all sorts of things go through your mind, and I figured, in essence, it's a western. Basically, it's a woman who has a nasty neighbor from her point of view, and has to fight against a state, and has to fight kind of decisions that basically affect her life. And she's really only trying to protect the trees that her father planted. That's kind of the core of it. And of course, the other side has its own reasons and its own paranoias. And so I was trying to do something which is, I'm not going to say I was trying to do something even-handed, but I was certainly trying to do something which is, for me, was the essence of this country, for better or for worse. Of course, I realized that it would be interesting to have not so much the Minister of Defense, but his wife. So it's really two women who never talk in the film. They never exchange one line of dialogue, but on both sides of the border, and they have a very strong sentiment about what's going on. And I think I wrote the synopsis in literally 3 hours. And then I decided to work again with Sua Araf, who's a Palestinian-Israeli, who co-wrote Syrian Bride with me, and she hated it. She said, no, it's too symbolic. I said, okay, listen, I'm going to make this film. You want to join me. You don't want to, fair enough. But she did eventually. And, it's a film that was done with a lot of passion. It was really done passion for the essence of the story, and also for this woman, this character, Salma, who I thought was a fascinating character, surrounded by other fascinating characters on both sides. And I felt I'm doing something which, and I always say this, and people always say, okay, come on, but it's not a political, I don't make political films. I don't create political films. I create films about people in political situations, which is literally everybody, I think, today in the world. And then when it becomes extreme, of course, it becomes extremely political. But in the end, people make decisions that affect other people's lives, and some people fight back. Now, I have to say that when the film had its premiere, and my distributor here is, his name is Moshe Edry, maybe you know him. He's the owner of United King and Cinema City. He's like an empire. Very nice guy who is very right wing. He's a very good friend of Bibi, which maybe won't help him starting tomorrow. But he loved the idea. He doesn't read scripts. So basically he hears a pitch and he says yes or no. And he loved the movie. He thought it was going to be a huge success because all his friends, who are mostly politicians, generals, and all, they all said, oh, this is wonderful. And of course, the film was a huge flop in Israel, really big. And but then I went to Berlin and I got the audience award, and the film, it's probably my biggest success outside of Israel. And I think here it took time for people to absorb to overcome the fact that it's, in a nutshell, it's a Palestinian woman suing the Minister of Defense. That's hard to take, I think, for an Israeli. But when you get over that, I think you realize it's about people and about their emotions. And now, would I do it differently today? I have to say it would probably be more bitter on both sides, because that's what we're going through now. And so I think it's probably bitter and painful more than it was then. Maybe it was bitter and painful enough then, but I think now it's really, I don't know. Somebody told me you should do Lemon Tree Part 2, but I doubt I'll do that. But,
So what makes why do some of the best films flop in Israel? Like they win a prize uh in the international arena, and in Israel they're flops. Like how does, like, is there some kind of uh I don't know, like why don't these films appeal to the Israeli audience?
I think the ongoing theory is that, and I think it applies to almost every country, is that we have enough of these stories on the news, so people kind of don't want to see them also in the cinema. And when you sort of say, yes, but this is not about the news, this is like going beyond the headlines, it's going beyond all that, and it's really trying to get to a certain truth. I never sort of say I'm telling the absolute truth, but I try to give the audience some, possible codes to be used when looking at the situation, which is not close to home, even though, this really, Lemon Tree could happen almost anywhere where there's so I think it's probably too close to home, but on the other hand, I think it's not always true because there's a nuance here because the Syrian Bride, for instance, which is also, it's touchy and sensitive politically, was a very big success here. But it was the Druze, it was not the Palestinians. The Palestinians, obviously, there's a lot of emotion, whatever way you look at it, doesn't matter what your politics are. But I did Dancing Arabs a few years ago, or it was called what was it called in the States? I forgot. A borrowed identity. A borrowed identity.
Yeah.
Because nobody could take Dancing Arabs in the title. So, yeah, I think it depends. I think there's really no rule, but the one thing I have to say, because there were many, it's often said that these films appeal to people outside of Israel because they show something that people want to see because they're not sympathetic to Israel. I think those notions, even today, when feelings about sentiments about Israel are complex and complicated, but I think that's not true. I think in the end, and this is something I'm very, I always say this, I think we Israeli filmmakers, if we make sense, and if we are sensitive to everything, to people mainly, then we are probably the best ambassadors of the country because, we create a debate. And the debate can become fierce. I've been sometimes in places where, not fist fights, but almost.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah,
Like, so when Susan commented, I think you'll see that in the chat, that just
yeah,
about like she lost her father, she lost her husband, her son didn't come and try and help her. She was losing her income, and it was just so much loss. So just that, I guess what Susan's saying is that human story, beyond the politics, the human story was just kind of heartbreaking anyway.
yeah. I think it's interesting because I think for me it's almost like the essence of American cinema in a way. Because this is about the hero, the person who goes to the Wild West and fights against the evil whoever landlords of some small village somewhere. It's about that, and I think in essence, it uses a lot of American codes in terms of what think about Eran Brockovich, for example. There's so many films that you can relate to, and especially when you have a woman in the leading role with all the complexities of being a Palestinian widow, which is like she's dead and buried basically from the point of view of the Palestinian society. Suddenly this young lawyer comes into her life and there's some tension there and there's pressures and there's of course the Israeli side, which is again, it's sensitive and it's insensitive like it is always. I think once we're talking about a situation of that involves the military, it can never be 100% sensitive. It's always complex in that sense. So yeah, but it's true that in the end, it's really about a woman who's protecting her trees, which are like her children, and her own children are not there. Her father is gone. Her husband is gone. Her husband likes to kind of look at her from his photo on the wall and to, give her some guilt feelings, and that's it. It's basically, for me, it was a study of this woman, and Niam was really the perfect, I think, the perfect actress to kind of fill this role.
I like the actor who plays her son in the United States.
Yeah.
I've What's his name? I can't.
Loai Nofi. He's now a big star. He actually started in Lemon Tree, and then he was in a film that I did called Zaytoon. He had another kind of role, kind of funny. He was like a comedian, but he's actually a serious actor, and he's wonderful. So,
Yeah, and he's been in some television series too.
yeah, yeah.
Are you doing anything in television, Eran? Israeli television is
Yeah.
so popular here. So many
I'm
shows.
actually developing a series which some of you may know. It's a true story from the early '60s, and it's called The Abduction of Yossele Schumacher. There was a kid back in 1961 who was abducted by his own Haredi grandfather,
Yeah.
taken out of the country by a convert, a French Catholic woman who became Jewish and became very kind of popular with the Orthodox community. And she actually smuggled him out of the country and took him across Europe for almost 2 years and
Oh,
finally ended up in Brooklyn. And at some point, Ben Gurion, who sort of said, enough is enough, and he asked the Mossad to look for the kid. And this was after they captured Eichmann, but before they could capture Mengele. And basically, the order was forget Mengele for now, find Yossele, which of course was kind of created a revolt, but they had no choice. And I think something like 45 Mossad agents went across Europe and the US to find this kid, which eventually they did. So it's an amazing story about, and it's so relevant because it's about the friction between the secular community and the Orthodox community. And it's about, I think the pain of parenthood and loss and so many things. It's really an amazing story. And I was amazed to see that nobody did anything about it over such a long time. So
we used to sing a song about Eifo Yosele, like where's Yosele?
exactly.
Yeah, it was like a huge
It was huge. It was
okay,
huge.
so we want to see that.
Yeah, I hope I can raise the money for it, but yeah.
Yeah, I wish we could help you with that. Um, So, another question is, we have some questions about shelter. Like first, um, what inspired it? And then the comment was another film about, two strong women. So what was the inspiration for shelter?
The inspiration was actually a short story. It's funny. It's a short story I read in a compilation of 3 short stories written by a man who was presumably, the PR said it's a Mossad, ex-Mossad agent who wrote 3 stories. And it was a very short story about a Mossad agent protecting a Lebanese collaborator in a safe house in Paris, actually. And I loved the story, and 2 years later, it's not that I discovered, it was announced, actually, the writer is Shulamit Evan, who's like a well-established woman writer, female writer, nothing to do with the Mossad, but then I learned that her husband was actually with the Mossad, but I didn't do anything about it. It took me years and years and years, and then at some point a few years ago, I realized that she passed away already, and I approached her husband, and I got the rights, and that was essentially the inspiration. I think for me, it was a natural choice with a twist, because it's my personal liking to kind of Mossad stories and thrillers and stuff like that, and yet 2 strong but very complex and very, I think, very scarred women, both of them, and within this, confined into a safe house, and I changed it to Germany, which I think gave it another interesting layer. I was just drawn to it, and then it was a tough film for me to make, because it really, I mentioned Polanski before, which is not, I know he's not a very popular name these days, but still, he's an amazing director, and there was something about it has this kind of Polanski touch in the sense that it's claustrophobic. It really centers on people, where the apartment becomes also part of the story, because from the minute the Mossad agent arrives, that this apartment used to belong to Jewish people who were obviously never came back after Auschwitz or somewhere else. So there was a lot of, and I shot it in Germany with a German crew. So for me, there was a lot of elements involved, and I think this combination between a small, intimate story or relationship between a Mossad agent, a woman, and a Lebanese. Even in the short story, the one thing I really kept was the fact that she always walks around with this red satin robe, which I thought, okay, it's like a statement in a way. Yeah. So I think it was really a combination of my love for the subject, but also the fact that it's a thriller.
Right,
I saw something about 3 mothers. Yeah.
Well, we have one question. Then we'll go on to 3 mothers. Someone wrote they were confused about the ending of Shelter. Was Naomi watching Lena leave with her son, or was she imagining it?
Who knows? I don't know.
Mm.
No, it was kind of, it depends really. It depends, I think, who you are as an audience. For me, because it's very tricky. If you sort of say everything is perfect, it means the Mossad is perfect, which nobody's perfect, as we know. And for me, it was more in the mind. It's a little bit, if you remember, if you saw the Syrian bride, when the bride crosses the border into Syria, did she really cross? Maybe not. Maybe it's all in the mind of her sister, that she's letting her sister go. And so I think for me, it was about you know, about achieving something against, it's a very male world they both live in, and it's a world of deceit, and I think every second thing that is said to them is a lie, probably. But they're clever as well, and they're full of deceit as well. So I think it's more about accomplishing something. And of course, there's it is a complex ending because is the kid dead, or did he really join his mother? But for me, let's say if I'm in an optimistic mood, which I tend to try and be, then I think it was just a perfect plan. Basically, they made it work. And finally, she makes it to Canada, which was not a bad place to go to, and the kid is with her. And so I think that's probably the real answer. I think it just worked. The plan worked, and the promise. I think was also about the fact that Nomi had to fulfill a certain promise, maybe for herself.
Right. And of course, everybody now recognizes her as Giti and Shtiso. You
I
know,
know,
she's
I know. She's
because
wonderful. I saw a lot of. I did auditions to like half of the actresses in Israel, I think. But when I saw her, I knew it's her. There was something about her which is, both fragile and strong, and
right.
and also a little bit seamless. Like she can blend into a crowd, and you won't notice her. But when you get up close, you realize her. And on the other hand, I used. It's very interesting because the actress who portrays Lina, the Lebanese, is actually Iranian. Golshifteh Farahani. You may have seen her in Patterson, the Jim Jarmusch film, and she's been in a lot of American indies and a lot of films in Europe, and she also does Pirates of the Caribbean. But she essentially left Iran. I think now it's already almost 20 years ago, and she left because once she became an actress in Europe, and I don't know, she had I think she was topless in one scene, and the Iranians gave her a lot of trouble. And she sort of said, "Okay, forget that. I'm out of here." So it was interesting to work, and she was. There was a point, I think 3 days before the shoot, she called me and she said, "I'm with you all the way, but I'm a little bit afraid for my family in Tehran because the family is still there." And I sort of said, "Golshifteh, if you have to, if you're afraid, then we should not be afraid." And I think people who create art should never be afraid, but you do become afraid sometimes. But she said no, it was just a phase. It was she was really brave. And when we released the film here, she did this amazing interview for the Israeli TV and all that. So this was like behind the scenes. There's an interesting story here in terms of my relationship with her as an Israeli and Iranian and all that.
Well, sometimes we comment on, you know, we see the same actors and the same actors in all the films and all the Israeli television shows. So
Yeah,
we feel like we get to know them. Um,
yeah,
we and how that what they really, because in each film or each show, it's like they sound the same and they're saying different things. You really kind of feel like you're seeing the same person in different situations. Um, so we have
yeah.
some
I see a question. I see the question here about
that about
Dina.
three mothers, and there's a question
Yeah.
about Dina. So one of the questions is it was about the film Three Mothers, that they loved it, and can you really give a baby to a stranger in Israel at that time? And then can you talk a little bit about Dina's perspective? Um, I think you meant as an Iraqi refugee and how it.
Iraqi, yeah, yeah. Well, I think when you look at these three mothers, when Dina started writing the script, I'll say this: back in long time ago, back in 1984, Dina made her first film as a director, as a writer director. It was a 40-minute film called Kurdania, which Kurdania is actually the name of the Ma'abara where she was raised when she was a kid. And it's a story about the two remaining families when they kind of, all the Ma'abarot were basically evacuated. But there were two families, one Iraqi and one Polish. And that's what the film is about. But in essence, it was about her mother and her father and about her as a kid. It's a film that I shot in '84. Was the last film I ever shot as a cinematographer. And then I realized, no, I'm a director. Forget it. I need more than just shooting. And so that's where it started. I think that's where Three Mothers started, and it took a very long time. And then she did a film called A Story That Begins with a Funeral of a Snake, which was based on a book. And I think from there, emotionally, I think she understood that her experience is an experience of immigration and of being a stranger in your own land because you come from a different culture and it takes a long time. And I think people who came from Iraq, people like Dina, her generation and her brother's generation, they were ashamed of their parents. Arabic was like, don't talk Arabic next to me. There was this whole no, and of course the way that Sephardi Jews were received by the Ashkenazis here, and the establishment. It's a very long story, as we know, but I think for Dina it was really about the isolation and the will, this deep need to be part of something, and at a price where you kind of possibly turn your back on your parents, and so many things. It's really very deep and very complex. And I think Dina has quite a few, or she had. Her mother is still alive. Like I said, she had a few aunts, and I think the film is essentially based on her mother and a couple of aunts. And then she panicked a bit, and she said, "Okay, they're going to be Egyptian and not Iraqis because the aunts are going to kill me." And so it changed to an Egyptian story. And also there was a practical reason, because the fact that one of them needs a transplant and has to go to Cairo to get it, you can't go back to Baghdad to do that. So it was, that was part of the kind of reasoning of the story. And it also, I think, gave her, I remember at the premiere when her aunts were still alive, came to the film and were a little bit worried, but nobody said anything. Actually, they were so proud. And nobody, oh, she gives away the kid. Okay, she had her reasons. It was all, it was very funny in a way. But and the story about the kid, could it happen? Probably. Did it happen? I don't know. Probably not. I think for Dina, it was really. And I was her producer, one of her two producers, and I tried to actually stay away a little bit, just to make sure that we have enough money. But because it was really her show, it's her most. I'm not sure it's her most. Yeah, I mean, it is, I guess, her most personal film, but it's also in a way it's a very commercial film, in a way, and it did really well here. Yeah, it's deeply rooted in Dina's. I think in both elements of being part of a community, a displaced community that struggled to kind of find its place over here. And the Iraqis, a lot of Iraqis went to London and became, Saatchi and Saatchi, all these kind of big things, especially in England, because they were always considered great accountants, and so a lot of them did well in the UK. Here, I think it's a combination of some did amazingly well, some not really so. Dina's father, it was a complicated story. He worked for the train company, and it was a tough life. I met him, but he passed away, a few years into our marriage. But yeah, but Three Mothers basically comes from. I think it's about roots in the end, and it's which I guess both Dina and myself I think a lot of what we do is about roots and connections to your own country, but also the human connection that where it's rooted and where does it take you, and yeah, that's kind of a partial answer.
Okay. Um, I know in some of my colleagues commented that they loved the Fifth Heaven, that
Yeah.
and I at one point, I mean, I don't know if it has any autobiographical um part, or and also
No.
was that how is that perceived in Israel? Like that?
Well, the Fifth Heaven is based on a book by a very popular writer. Rachel Eitan is her name. She had a very popular book before that called, I don't remember, what was like a, how do you call it, a roman à clef, like a key, how do you call that? A
Uh,
novel where, it's like about fictional characters, but actually you can realize who they are. So it was something about Tel Aviv, and then she wrote, I think for her it was autobiographical, but for Dina, it became, I think this book was very influential for her when she was younger. And she connected extremely strongly with again, the dysfunctional families and the fact that there are no roots. There's a very big, I think, a very powerful scene in the Fifth Heaven when I can't remember her name, but the woman who works at the orphanage takes the trees out of the ground, the trees that are actually planted just for the American donors, which is actually a reflection on a scene from Salah Shabati, if you remember that film, which is exactly the same thing. That's what he does. Because so there's a lot of kind of small connections here. And I think what I can say is for Dina, probably it's a trilogy. It's really the snake story, which I suspect you haven't seen, but I think all three films are really about dysfunctional families or immigration, immigrants who become dysfunctional because of the new circumstances and the struggle basically to break out of that. I think that's what her films are about. And I think when you look at documentary, the Mahabarot, the documentary series, it's also about that in essence. It's about people who was thrown into the, and it's really, we tend to, but again, I think America knows it also very well as a country of immigrants. As people were torn away from so many places and from so many strong roots, and had to find their way. And not everyone is successful in that sense.
so can you? I know Mahabarot. We showed Mahabarot in our spring or fall, one of our fest. Eileen is nodding. We had two film festivals this year, and Mahabarot was one of the. Uh,
We showed it both times,
oh, we
spring and
showed,
fall. We
that's why I
couldn't
can't
get
remember.
it was so people missed it, and they were writing me and saying, "I missed it. Please show it again."
Right.
Yeah. It was.
Well,
I think it was an amazing experience for everybody who was involved because Dina was probably the only one from the people who were involved in it who grew up in the Mahabara and knew what she was talking about. And it's interesting because I think it's a very, you could say it's a formal kind of documentary. It's interviews in the studio and a lot of footage, some of it rare, but it's not on surface. It's not a personal documentary. It's not somebody going back to the Mahabara and exploring what happened there. But it became personal because I really think it's because of Dina. It's from an academic attempt, it became something very personal, and I think it struck a chord with so many people here because it's one of these strange things where supposedly we're supposed to know. It's almost like you sort of want to say, Mahabharata, I've seen it 100 times, but you haven't. There was never anything that really tackled the subject deeply and with respect, and also with question marks. There are many questions about which I think probably will never be solved. Also, because a lot of secrets just went to the grave, with all these people. But
where
yeah,
did the footage? Where did the footage come from Mahabarot? It's amazing that there was so much to work with.
yeah. I think I think probably Spielberg was helpful, and that's I think he created something here that. Well, Israel, we do have a strong tradition of newsreels going back to I think the 50s that were shown in the cinemas. Like like the British movie tone, or in America, I'm not sure what it was, but because there was no television here until 1968, so basically news was on the radio or in the cinema. And it was pretty amazing stuff because it was black and white, 35 millimeter was shot, beautiful stuff. I think that was one part, but that was maybe the easy part. I think it was digging into both personal archives and national archives that were a little bit kind of hidden. American, I mean, the Spielberg kind of syndrome that really, I think, helped put a proper archive together here. Yeah, but it was a very long time in the making.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Do you know what Dina's working on now? What's the next
Yeah,
project?
I know I'm her producer, but again, after 3 months, she gave an interview to Arendt, and she said, "I will never work with him again. He was horrible to me."
Well,
Do
we've
everything
all,
from.
most of us have worked at home this year with a lot of,
I know.
with a spouse this year. It hasn't been easy.
Yeah, no, right. No, Dina is working on a few things. She's well, actually, it's interesting because she's doing they don't have the money yet, but they're trying to do a series of documentaries like Marlborough about what's called, how's it called, the mixed cities, like, the cities that have Arab and Jewish communities. So, Haifa, Akko, Lud, where all the riots were now.
Right.
And suddenly, in the middle of developing this, suddenly all these riots broke out. It was crazy. It was like, we've got to get the money and just go out and shoot, which, it doesn't happen that way. But I think it certainly gave them a boost to, I think it's an extremely important subject, which was explored already, but not really deeply. And on the fiction side, she's working on it's a book written by Emily Moati, who was yesterday, she's a writer, rather, I mean, like in her early 40s. And she wrote a book about her own personal experience going to Paris and going through a very traumatic time there. And she went into politics recently with Labour Party here. And she came in, I think, number 3. And yesterday she was elected to be the vice chairman of the Knesset, which is quite impressive. So, we're doing a book written by the deputy chairman of the Knesset, which is kind of nice, I guess. And she's she comes from Netanya, which is this strange city just north of Tel Aviv, which is both touristic but also kind of working class and a lot of crime. And she grew up also in a kind of tough family, so it's a classic. It's exactly the kind of people we need in politics here. People who come from the heart of the country and but still make some kind of sense, socially speaking and politically.
Okay. What's it like having two filmmakers in the same family? Anything?
Respect and suspect. It's like it's basically. I think for us, we realized when we met, all those years ago, that this is going to be complicated, but complicated in a fascinating way because we both. I think we share the same taste in cinema, more or less. Maybe I'm a little bit more superficial, so But basically, we like to make films that matter, that at least deal with something that is relevant to what's going on in society in general, of course, in Israeli society in particular. And the struggles, I always say, I think the struggles of being a filmmaker, of course, it's a different ball game when you're doing a Marvel movie, but I think at the end of the day, it's. I always say, I don't teach a lot because I don't have a lot of time, but when I do teach, I sort of say to students, listen, at the end of the day, there's an actor, there's a camera, and and you're there to judge if this is good or bad. And it's the same thing that, again, we'll mention Spielberg again. He has the same dilemmas. He has a great actor in front of him. He has to make sure that his performance is great. And he has to make sure that his cameraman is doing the perfect job. So I think the pressures are the same, and the expectations are the same. And our kids are my daughter, who gave birth last week. She's a kind of a political journalist, and she used to be an artist. Now she's a journalist. She's very kind of very strong. She has a website called Ha'oketz, which means the sting. So it's a kind of social, political. So she's very involved in these kind of things. And my son is a jazz pianist, so jazz is never easy, but it's wonderful. And so, I think we are, we have our challenges, but it's been fascinating all these years, and I hope we have enough years left to keep it fascinating.
Just had so many of us had looked at the silver linings of COVID, of this isolation or time at home.
Yeah,
But we're in the United States, there hasn't been a lot of films made or released during COVID, and there was a question if it's the same in Israel. Are there things waiting for release that?
a lot, a lot. Actually, the cinemas happily opened on Thursday, just 3 days ago, and apparently it went well. I mean, people came to the cinemas. It's almost like I spoke today to the owner of a cinema chain. He said his biggest problem is the fact that the projectors, some of them weren't working because for like 14 months they just stood idle. So it was a big effort, I think, to bring the cinemas back to life. The selection of movies is, a little bit complex, but still there's there's like No Man's Land, and I mean, there's a lot of good films that were waiting to be released. I think there's a lot of Israeli films that were waiting to be released. And it was television. I think never stopped here, so there was a lot of series that were shot actually during the year. But for people like me and Dina, it was mainly writing. And for me, it was really weird because I'm on Yossele, on the Schumacher kidnapping. I'm working with a company based in Los Angeles, where they still have been to the office since March last year. It's amazing. So you work with people, like we have a Zoom every week or two, and they're home. And now they're vaccinated already, but they're still worried about going to the office. So, and I can't wait for the moment to actually, go to LA or New York or Paris or London, just to be in front of someone, next to a table and bang on the table and sort of say, what's going on? Let's get this done. So I think it's been a year where there's been a lot of frustrations for everybody because Zoom has become popular, but it's at the end of the day, you really need to meet people. On the other hand, I think it allowed all of us to focus quite strongly on our work. I have to say that Dina and I, for the last 6 years, it's not adoption because she has a mother, but we're kind of taking care of an Eritrean refugee who's now 11. She was born here. We met her when she was more or less 4.5 or 5. Her mother is like a single mother. Who came here, walked from Sudan, but she's from Eritrea. She escaped. Basically, she was supposed to be drafted to the army. The classic story of the African refugees here, the Eritrean refugees, and she's become like part of our life. But 2.5 years ago, I managed to arrange in a very complex way for the mother and the kid to immigrate to Canada. And it's sponsorships, and I basically every person I met wherever I sort of said, "Can you spare $500 for because I had to put money in the bank in Toronto." And I did this really big thing, and of course, COVID stopped everything. It was like literally they were supposed to leave in April, but in March COVID started, so the Canadians stopped everything. And true to now, it's still on hold, but I hope it's going to happen. So this year was also a challenge in terms of of kind of taking care of another child who's not our immediate family, but she's like family. And now she's 11, which is of course a crazy age where they have their own mind, and basically she's a teenager, so not easy, but it's fun. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we hope when you start traveling again that you'll think about Chicago as a step. You were supposed to come a few years ago, and got I don't know, had something happened.
Yeah. I
You never.
remember I have to tell you something funny. My first, no, not my first, but one of my first film festivals was Chicago International back in 91. Because with Cup Final, which was my first proper film, I was in Venice. It was a very big success. So then all the festivals wanted me, and Michael Kutza, I think his name was, right? The head of the festival, the international festival. He brought me over, and I came from Spain, and my luggage was all lost. And I had a premiere, and there was this woman at the Israeli consulate in Chicago who took me to shop at Gap or whatever. And to this day, if she meets me, it doesn't matter if it's a cocktail with hundreds of people, she says, "This is Mr. Rickless. I bought him underwear and socks in Chicago." And so,
Okay, well, we'll treat you to something else here
exactly.
when you come to Chicago. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time, and
Thank you.
really enjoyed chatting. Any last questions from our audience? I think we're, um, and again, Mazal Tov and the birth of Elinor.
Yeah,
And give Dina our regards. We missed her.
I will.
And
Yeah.
thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed chatting with Eran. I hope you enjoyed the films. I hope you'll join us for more of the Chicago Jewish Film Festival. And I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.